Alright, let's talk about Oscar Wilde, one of the most brilliant, witty and tragic figures in English literature. Born in 1854 in Dublin, Wilde was an Irish poet, novelist and playwright, and that simple fact, Irish poet and playwright, has been asked in exam. His parents were intellectuals, and from an early age, Wilde spoke French and German fluently. He studied classics at Trinity College, Dublin, and later at Oxford, where he absorbed the philosophy of aestheticism from John Ruskin and Walter Pater, the idea that art exists purely for beauty's sake, not for moral instruction. After Oxford, Wilde moved to London, where his charm, wit, and flamboyant personality made him the toast of society. He lectured widely on topics like the English Renaissance in art, that's been asked in exam, and he became the public face of the aesthetic movement. His early works included poetry collections like Ravenna in 1878 and poems in 1881, but it was his fiction and plays that made him immortal. Now, Wilde's only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, another exam favorite, was first published in Lippincott's monthly magazine in 1890 and then expanded into a book the next year. The novel explores beauty, sin, and the corruption of the soul, a perfect reflection of Wilde's belief that art mirrors life's paradoxes. But Wilde truly dominated the 90 seconds as a playwright. He wrote 4 sparkling society comedies: Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892, A Woman of No Importance, 1893, An Ideal Husband, first performed in 1895, and The Importance of Being Earnest, also from 1895, one of the greatest English comedies ever written. Each of these plays skewers Victorian hypocrisy with Wilde's trademark wit. He also wrote the tragedy Salome, though it was banned in England for its biblical subject matter, and yes, that's a common exam question. Wilde's fairy tales, like The Happy Prince and other stories from 1888 and The House of Pomegranates from 1891, show his tender, symbolic side. His essay collection, Intentions from 1891, develops his aesthetic philosophy, while The Soul of Man Under Socialism applies his artistic ideals to politics. But Wilde's dazzling career came crashing down after his infamous libel case against the Marquess of Queensberry, which exposed his homosexual relationships. The trial ended in Wilde's conviction for gross indecency, and he spent 2 years in prison from 1895 to 1897, another important exam point. During imprisonment, Wilde wrote De Profundis, a long, soul-bearing letter that reflects on love, suffering, and forgiveness, written in 1897 and published posthumously in several versions. After his release, he moved to France, living in exile under the name Sebastian Melmoth. There he wrote his final work, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, 1898, a moving poem about prison life and human compassion, also asked in exam. Wilde died 2 years later, in 1900, at the age of 46, destitute but unforgotten. His tomb in Paris's Père Lachaise cemetery has become a shrine for admirers around the world. Even in death, Wilde's words live on, witty, poignant, and unforgettable. As Samuel Johnson once said of another great writer, Wilde too, left scarcely any kind of writing untouched, and touched nothing that he did not adorn. So, when you think of Wilde, remember the wit of The Importance of Being Earnest, the soul-searching of De Profundis, and the beauty of The Picture of Dorian Gray, all united by one idea that life itself should be lived as a work of art. Alright, let's step into the glittering yet shadowy world of Oscar Wilde, where art, beauty, and morality collide. His only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in 1891, is a fascinating blend of philosophy, decadence, and horror. And yes, it's a philosophical novel. That phrase has been asked in exam. Now, here's something interesting. Dorian Gray was first published as a novella in Lippincott's magazine in 1890, and then expanded into a novel a year later, and that fact too has been asked in exam. The story begins with Basil Hallward, an artist who becomes infatuated with the beauty of a young man named Dorian Gray. He paints Dorian's portrait, the portrait that becomes the heart of the story. And yes, Basil as the painter of the portrait is another frequent exam question. During a visit, Basil's witty and cynical friend Lord Henry Wotton meets Dorian and begins to shape his mind. Lord Henry preaches a philosophy of pure pleasure, of living for sensation, beauty and experience without moral restraint. His hedonistic influence changes Dorian forever, and that influence has been noted in exam. In a moment of youthful vanity, Dorian makes a fateful wish that his portrait would age instead of him. And incredibly, that wish comes true. Soon, Dorian falls in love with Sybil Vane, a beautiful actress. But when she performs poorly one night, he cruelly rejects her. Heartbroken, Sybil commits suicide, another key point that's often tested. When Dorian returns home, he notices something horrifying. The face in his portrait now looks slightly cruel. From that moment, the painting becomes a mirror of his soul, recording every sin while his own face remains perfect and youthful. He hides the portrait in his attic and plunges deeper into a life of indulgence and corruption. Years later, Basil confronts him, begging him to repent. In a fit of rage and shame, Dorian murders Basil, a turning point in the story. That act of violence haunts him, and his descent into paranoia and guilt begins. Eventually, Dorian tries to destroy the portrait, stabbing it in a desperate attempt to free himself from its curse. But when servants break in, they find a grotesque, aged man dead on the floor, and the portrait once again shows Dorian Gray as young and innocent. That final transformation, Dorian's aged body and the restored painting, has been asked in exam as the novel's symbolic conclusion. So, whilst the picture of Dorian Gray isn't just a story about vanity, it's a warning about moral corruption under the mask of beauty, the danger of living only for pleasure. Now, let's move to Oscar Wilde's stage, where his wit shines brightest. Lady Windermere's Fan, subtitled A Play About a Good Woman, is a 4-act comedy first performed in 1892, and that's been asked in exam. The play begins with Lady Windermere, who suspects her husband of infidelity. Rumors reach her that Lord Windermere has been secretly giving money to a mysterious woman named Mrs. Erlynne. Lady Windermere, deeply hurt, confronts her husband, but Lord Windermere refuses to explain, insisting she's wrong. In truth, Mrs. Erlynne has a secret. She is actually Lady Windermere's mother, long thought dead, trying to re-enter society. At Lady Windermere's birthday ball, Mrs. Erlynne appears, shocking everyone. Furious and humiliated, Lady Windermere decides to run away with the charming Lord Darlington, who has long admired her. But here comes the emotional twist. Mrs. Erlynne, determined to protect her daughter's reputation, follows her and convinces her to return home even at the cost of her own good name. By the end, Lady Windermere's honor is saved, though she never learns the full truth. The audience, however, sees Mrs. Erlynne's selfless act and her quiet redemption. So, beneath all the witty dialogue and social satire, Lady Windermere's Fan is about forgiveness, sacrifice, and how appearances deceive. Wilde balances sharp humor with real human emotion, a combination that makes this one of his most enduring plays. Together, the picture of Dorian Gray and Lady Windermere's Fan show both sides of Oscar Wilde, the philosopher of beauty and the master of comedy, each exposing the masks that hide our moral truths. Wilde's plays aren't just funny, they're razor-sharp commentaries on hypocrisy, gender roles, and moral double standards. Today, we'll look at 3 of his finest: A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest. Let's start with A, Woman of No Importance. First performed in 1893, Wilde called it a new and original play of modern life, and it unfolds in 4 acts. At first, it seems like a polite drawing room drama. but beneath the social chatter lies a story of deep injustice. The play centers on Gerald Arbuthnot, an ambitious young man offered a promising position by the wealthy and charming Lord Illingworth, and that offer has been asked in exam. But there's a catch. Gerald's mother, Mrs. Arbuthnot, strongly opposes the idea without explaining why. Slowly, the truth emerges. Lord Illingworth is actually Gerald's estranged father, the man who abandoned Mrs. Arbuthnot years earlier, leaving her to raise their child alone. When Illingworth tries to reclaim his son, Gerald rejects him, a powerful reversal in a society that usually forgave men and blamed women. The play boldly criticizes the double standards of Victorian morality, how men's sins were overlooked while women paid the price. That theme of society's hypocrisy toward women has been directly asked in exam. Now, moving to 1895, Wilde gives us another masterpiece, An Ideal Husband, also a 4-act play. Here, Wilde explores morality, marriage, and politics with his usual sparkle. The story revolves around Sir Robert Chiltern, a respected politician who hides a guilty secret from his past. He made his fortune by selling a government secret. Enter Mrs. Cheveley, a clever and manipulative woman who tries to blackmail him with proof of his wrongdoing. Robert's wife, Lady Chiltern, believes him to be morally perfect. That line about her idealized vision of her husband has been asked in exam. When she learns the truth, her world collapses. But help comes from Wilde's classic dandy figure, Lord Goring, who outsmarts Mrs. Cheveley by exposing her own deceit. By the end, Lady Chiltern learns to forgive, realizing that moral perfection is impossible and human love requires compassion. The play ends with reconciliation, honesty, and redemption, all wrapped in Wilde's signature wit. And now for the grand finale, The Importance of Being Earnest, also from 1895, Wilde's most famous play and perhaps the greatest comedy of manners ever written. It's a play about identity, deception, and the delightful absurdities of upper-class life. The story follows Jack Worthing and Algernon Moncrieff, two young men leading double lives, and yes, that theme of dual identity has been asked in exam. Jack pretends to be someone named Earnest when he's in the city, while Algernon invents an imaginary invalid friend named Bunbury so he can escape social duties, hence Bunburying. Jack wants to marry Gwendolen, Algernon's cousin, but there's a problem. Gwendolen insists she can only love a man named Earnest. Meanwhile, Algernon falls for Jack's ward, Cecily, who coincidentally is also in love with someone called Earnest without realizing her Earnest is Algernon in disguise. All these deceptions unravel in a series of hilarious scenes until, in true Wildean fashion, everything resolves with one of literature's best punchlines. Jack discovers his real name is Earnest after all, and that he is actually Gwendolen's cousin by birth. The play ends with Wilde's immortal line, The Importance of Being Earnest, both in name and in nature. What ties these three plays together is Wilde's genius for contrast, appearance versus reality, morality versus hypocrisy, and sincerity versus social performance. His characters live in a glittering world of drawing rooms, witty banter, and well-tailored lies. So to recap for exam, a woman of no importance, Gerald, discovers Lord Illingworth is his father. Mrs. Arbuthnot defends her dignity. An ideal husband, Robert Chiltern, faces blackmail, his wife learns forgiveness, and Lord Goring saves the day. The Importance of Being Earnest, mistaken identities, double lives, and the perfect comedic twist. Earnest is really earnest. Wilde once said, "Life is far too important a thing ever to talk seriously about." And through these plays, he proved that behind laughter, there's always truth. All right, let's talk about one of Oscar Wilde's most brilliant and mischievous essays, The Decay of Lying. It's not a formal essay, but a Socratic dialogue between two characters, Vivian and Cyril, and yes, that's been asked in exam. The conversation takes place in a London drawing room, but it's far from ordinary small talk. It's Wilde at his sharpest, defending his artistic philosophy, aestheticism, or as he loved to say, art for art's sake. Now, the dialogue was published in Wilde's essay collection Intentions. In 1891, another must-remember exam point. Vivian, who represents Wilde's own views, announces that he's written an article titled The Decay of Lying, a protest. And that phrase, a protest, is important because the essay really is a rebellion against realism and factual writing. Vivian begins by claiming that lying has decayed, not lying as in telling fibs, but lying as an art, a science, and a social pleasure. Yes, that exact phrase has been asked in exam. He complains that people have become obsessed with facts and truth to such an extent that they've killed imagination. In his view, modern literature suffers because it worships reality instead of creating beauty. Vivian declares boldly, as a method, realism is a complete failure. That line alone sums up Wilde's argument and, of course, it's a frequent exam question. He argues that true art should never copy life or nature. In fact, he turns that idea upside down. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. In other words, people and even nature behave according to how art has taught them to look and feel. For instance, he says fogs didn't exist in London until painters started painting them beautifully. He even takes this idea further. Nature, he says, is no less an imitation of art than life itself. Another line worth marking, it's been asked in exam too. For Vivian, the problem with realism is that it drags art down to mere description. He warns that if something cannot be done to check our monstrous worship of facts, art will become sterile and beauty will pass away from the land. That's one of Wilde's most quoted lines, so definitely note it down. Instead, Vivian insists that art must be independent of moral or social purpose. It should exist purely for beauty. In his words, the highest art rejects the burden of the human spirit. She develops purely on her own lines. She is not symbolic of any age. That's Wilde's clearest defense of aestheticism, and yes, it's been asked in exam. Toward the end, Vivian sums up the doctrines of the new aesthetics. These are vital for quick recall. Art never expresses anything but itself. The essence of all bad art is a return to life and nature as ideals. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life, and external nature imitates art too. The purpose of art is to tell beautiful, untrue things. That last line, to tell beautiful, untrue things, captures Wilde perfectly. He believed that beauty mattered more than truth and imagination mattered more than realism. So, the decay of lying isn't really about dishonesty at all. It's about reclaiming imagination as the highest form of truth. Wilde, through Vivian, gently mocks the dull seriousness of Victorian realism and reminds us that art should dazzle, not document. In short, the essay celebrates lying as the art of creation, exaggeration, invention, and beauty for their own sake. Or, as Wilde himself would put it, the only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.